Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. I'm here with Professor Mary Ziegler, who is a legal historian and professor of law at Florida State University. Mary is one of the world's leading authorities on the legal history of American abortion debate. Her dozens of law review articles have appeared in leading law reviews, and her work on abortion has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, the New York Daily News, and BBC History magazine. She often shares her expertise with news outlets in the United States and around the world. She's written 3 books, and today we are here to discuss today's reality, as well as her new book, Abortion and the Law in America. Professor, welcome aboard Politics Done Right. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks.
Now, first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. What got you into this particular field that you're into?
So I started actually thinking about writing about this stuff when I was in law school. And we were reading about how social movements use law to change the world and to change politics. And I had kept kind of waiting for the book about Roe v. Wade. We had read lots of books about racial justice, about Brown versus Board of Education. So I was sort of waiting, where's the Roe v. Wade book going to be? And my professor said, well, there is no Roe v. Wade book. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Somebody needs to write that book. So I thought I would do it, which was kind of naive to think when I was, 24. But I've been kind of trying to write that book ever since then, because there's lots of heat on this topic, but not necessarily a lot of light, not a lot of actual information. So I was really attracted to the idea of doing history rather than advocacy about it.
Now, I'm an engineer by training, and I always have a basic question. What is so difficult about this issue? If an entity is attached to a person, shouldn't that person that entity is dependent of have preeminence, meaning nobody should really have the right to get in and talk about what you do with that entity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously been an argument that's been very compelling to lots of people in the United States and across the world. I think the reason that the issue is so difficult in the United States, and really it's kind of worth saying, the United States is fairly unique in that way, right? I mean, even if you look, for example, at Catholic countries like Ireland, there's been a more sort of stable settlement of this issue than we've seen here. So I think the problem here is kind of twofold. One, the United States is quite religious compared to other countries, and religious not just in the sense that people say they're religious, but that it actually informs their daily lives. They go to church, they actually seem committed to these beliefs. And many of course, of the religious communities in the United States are opposed to abortion. I think probably even more to the point, political parties have kind of been making hay on the abortion issue for a long time. It's a wedge issue, and political parties get something out of that. I mean, you need look no further than Donald Trump, who really it's kind of hard to imagine would ever have become president without the abortion issue or the promise that he could appoint Supreme Court justices who would overrule Roe v. Wade. So we have, I think, both in the Democratic and Republican Party, forces that kind of stoke the fires on abortion in a way that you don't see in other countries where abortion really isn't a political issue.
Now, I guess it's also a patriarchal issue, right? Because most of the people trying to build laws on this or put restrictions or otherwise seem to be mostly men. Why is it that in a population of over 50% women is that still the case, especially liberated women purportedly?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. So I think on the one hand, it's actually more interesting to me in some ways that there are lots of women who are opposed to abortion too. So just to take one kind of very salient example, Alabama last year banned lots of abortions, or pretty much all abortions from the moment of fertilization without exceptions for rape or incest. And the governor who signed that into law was a woman.
Was a woman, yes.
Yeah, and so one of the sort of interesting questions, is why that is. And so I certainly think that there are lots of people who oppose abortion, partly because they think it's unnatural and sort of cheating women of their natural roles, which is, of course, can be and often is a kind of patriarchal concept. But it's interesting how often women themselves belong to and even lead the movement. And some of that obviously is strategic. You know, abortion opponents have reasons for wanting to put women front and center, but there are women who are willing to be front and center who believe these things. And that's, I think, one of the reasons it's so hard to get to some kind of meaningful solution on abortion, because what would seem to be an obvious, you know, women should agree that women shouldn't be regulated by men, is not something that American women in fact agree on, which is one of the reasons we have such a kind of dysfunctional debate.
Now, I speak to it as an economic issue as well, because I think many people just look at, let's say, disparities between men and women and as simply an issue of the way things are. Patriarchy, it has a lot more to do with that. Give me your sense of the economic issue that that childbearing and abortion has on women and have on women in the country.
Well, I think there have been lots of really compelling studies done on the consequences of denying access to abortion to women who would otherwise have ended pregnancies. The University of San Francisco, for example, researchers there did what was called the Turnaway study that looked at what happened to women who had pursued abortion and then been denied because of state laws. And they found that the outcomes were pretty devastating when it came to things like interruptions to women's education or to their ability to hold a job and support children that they already had. Essentially, I think the idea is that people expected to be able to decide when they could have children or when they were ready to or able to support children, and then learned that the law didn't enable them to make that choice. And so they had to kind of adjust on the fly. And of course, those adjustments were disproportionately being made by women who were poor, women who were Black, women who had fewer resources to begin with. Because as you can imagine, it's always been true before Roe v. Wade to the present that women with more resources are not really as constrained by the abortion restrictions, right? They can travel out of state, they can stay in a hotel if they need to, they probably have jobs that will give them time off in order to have an abortion. Poorer women don't have the same luxury when it comes to childcare, when it comes to travel, when it comes to staying at a hotel, when it comes to childcare. So when you're thinking about the economic consequences of these laws, it's important to sort of think through the fact that they're not the same, that they're very different for different groups of women in the United States.
Equal application of the law, and in effect, implicitly that can't occur if there are disparities with the way states implement abortion. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about what does the right to abortion actually mean right now, it really depends on your zip code. So even if you look at where abortions occur, like a hugely disproportionate number of abortions occur in California, New York, and Florida. Now, part of that is because those are large states, but part of it is also because it's relatively easy to access abortions in those states. There are other states that have one abortion provider, maybe often a small one. Yeah, Missouri is a good example, Kentucky. So there are lots of states where abortion is not officially illegal, but is almost inaccessible already. And so there are, if you think about it, there are already huge disparities geographically as well as economically and racially.
You segued into an important area, death by 1,000 cuts. In other words, it's not even necessary to abolish Roe versus Wade, because there are so many restrictions. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of those? You know, we had the attempts in Louisiana that was just dispelled by the Supreme Court, and we've had state after state, many of them considerably red states, that are doing all these techniques. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, so we just had the Supreme Court, in my opinion, and we can talk more about the Supreme Court, but I think the Supreme Court case, which everybody heralded as this big win for pro-choice people, I think is not a big win, but we can talk a little bit more about why.
I would actually, you know, you are one of the, I've seen articles that talk about Roberts likes to tie the knots very well. And because of the previous case, he didn't want, you know, the previous Texas case kind of tied his perfectionist hand, but he pretty much gave the blueprint as to how that case should return to the Supreme Court for ultimate success. you just came out and said it was simply not a win. So why don't you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so going into the case, one of the questions was, how seriously does this new conservative majority take precedent? And in particular, this 2016 precedent called Holman's Health versus Hellerstedt. And that case mattered for two reasons. One, because it struck down this kind of death by a thousand cuts law and admitting privileges law. But two, because it also made the rules that apply to all abortion restrictions a little bit more rigorous. So it was harder for states to justify abortion restrictions. And how it was harder was because the Supreme Court said, you guys actually have to show that the costs of these laws don't outweigh the benefits, and that these laws actually have a point. So you can't just sort of say, oh, this protects women or this law is great. You actually have to have some kind of evidence that you know what you're talking about, that a court will take a hard look at. So Chief Justice Roberts said, okay, I'm taking precedent seriously. These two laws, the Texas law and the Louisiana law, are the same, so I'm going to join my liberal colleagues. But he totally rewrote the rules that apply to all abortion regulations going forward, and he made them much easier for states to pass. So now states don't have to show that there's any purpose to their abortion restrictions, and courts have to be relatively deferential to states when they talk about what the facts on the ground are. So even though the pro-choice movement kind of won this round, Roberts made it a lot easier going forward for abortion opponents to win subsequent rounds, basically by rewriting what the law was, all while claiming he was, pro-precedent. So it was I think Stephen Mazie in The Economist said it was canny. That's, I think, Roberts to the core, and I think that's kind of where we are right now in terms of the Supreme Court.
I don't think I had heard that well, you found an article with it, but that is interesting because in effect you're saying that this was a big favor for the next round. Yeah, we understood that he pretty much gave them the direction on how to write it, but you're telling me that he also made it was a slippery slope, and that he made it easier for other states to do a whole lot worse.
Yeah, so when I was asked to write a bunch about this in a lot of media outlets, and so I wrote about it on the day of in the New York Times and a couple other places. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought that really pro-choice groups hadn't entirely won at all. Like, I knew it was sort of not a big victory, or it was a kind of temporary victory, but now I even question if it was a victory, because I think the thing everybody wanted was to see that Roberts would have genuine respect for precedent. And saying you have respect for precedent while completely changing what the law is, that isn't respect for precedent, right?
It's just an underhanded way of getting where you really ultimately want to go, right?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think if you had real respect for precedent, you would actually have to leave it alone, right? Not completely say, like, it'd be sort of like if you said, I have respect for precedent, Roe v. Wade is a precedent, but there's no more right to choose. Like, then you're just changing what it means to the point where the precedent is useless, right? I mean, I think that, and so it's also a roadmap, because if Roberts wants to say he has respect for precedent, abortion opponents are going to have to, respect that and deal with that. But that doesn't mean that they can't get rid of protections for abortion along the way. We've already seen that.
In my layman way of thinking about the law, I actually thought that what Roberts was doing was being Mr. Pragmatist. In other words, he's trying to, there are certain things that how society has changed, that his attempt was to be moderate and not have too many gradients, because that's where you get riots and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But after listening to you now, I'm a bit concerned, because it may be that he's just a much smoother operator, especially for a lay person with the law, like most of us are.
Well, and I think your sense of Roberts is absolutely right. I mean, the term a lot of lawyers use is that Roberts is an institutionalist, which means basically he sort of cares about the court's legacy, he cares about his own reputation, he cares about how things look, right? Which means that he doesn't want to do something that will produce a big political backlash, that'll make a lot of people, like ordinary lay people, angry. The problem is that if he does things in a kind of stealth way that ordinary people don't understand, the Supreme Court can achieve the same practical result, right? Whether that's on abortion or voting rights or a million other things. And normal people won't understand and therefore won't care, right? I mean, there's not going to be a backlash if nobody knows what's going on. And so that might kind of be, if Roberts's hasn't a brand that's emerging, that might be it.
Well, I mean, I think you've already proven that, right? The mere fact that most of us sit back there and still think, not still, but many still think that, wow, it's a big win. Yeah, a little bit of caution here, but it's a big win. You've just about busted a hole into that.
Yeah, well, and I think even with LGBT rights, of course, one of the other big decisions this term, the Bostock case said that Title VII, which is our kind of landmark civil rights law, also covers LGBTQ employees. And even that, there's been sort of an exception. The Supreme Court yesterday essentially said that civil rights laws don't apply to religious employers, more or less. So
True.
there's always been a sort of, the court gives with one hand and takes away
And
with the
takes it.
other kind of vibe. So I think
Yeah, but that was
clearly
that was a dangerous take, because I mean, employers can do quite a bit with that change, that
oh yeah,
new interpretation of the law, right?
absolutely. I mean, if you look at probably the most significant, so the idea that employers have to, if you're like a church, that you can decide you have more latitude in hiring and firing employees makes sense, right? They call this the ministerial exception, on the theory that, you wouldn't tell a church who to have as a minister. But the court has been extraordinarily generous to employers in terms of who counts as a religious employee, right? So like, is the janitor a religious employee? Is the person who answers the phone a religious employee? Are people who don't really do religious jobs religious employees, such that employers don't have to follow civil rights laws? And the Supreme Court yesterday said more or less, we're going to just defer to employers on that. So if an employer says this person is doing an important religious job, that's pretty much going to take care of it, which, as you can imagine, employers will say, if they're religious entities, will
Right.
say everybody is doing religious work. So there's already a kind of big hole in the protections for LGBT employees that we saw the court create earlier this term.
Now, even without having to use the law, in my opinion, seems like COVID-19 has given sort of some power to states for, if only temporary,
Mm-hmm.
ultimately get their costs. After all, COVID is going to be with us more than 4 months or so. So, I mean, there are going to be quite a lot of cycles that women pretty much, without having to go through the law,
Mm-hmm.
lose their rights, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some states we're trying, and I think this may happen again, some states were trying to, of course, ban abortion during the pandemic, on the theory that abortion essentially used up personal protective equipment and hospital beds. And that was always a little bit dubious, because most abortions, especially early in pregnancy, just involve people taking pills. They wouldn't theoretically even need to involve face-to-face contact. In most parts of the world, they don't require face-to-face contact. And they certainly wouldn't involve more, even if you have a surgical abortion, you'd have personal protective equipment, of course, if women continue pregnancies too, because then they would have to go to the doctor and go to the hospital for delivery and so on. Those orders essentially looked like they were headed to the US Supreme Court, but then a lot of these red states backed off, not because they didn't want to ban abortion, but because, as you know, a lot of states like Florida, where I am, unfortunately, have reopened and had surges in cases. So we may, if states like Texas and Florida feel kind of like they have to start closing down again because of the pandemic, I wouldn't be surprised to see new abortion bans. The only reason we don't see them now is because the president has been pressuring red states to open everything, including access to medical procedures.
Okay, let's go ahead and quickly get to one of the important pieces here: abortion and the law in America. What is the person who reads this book gonna get out of it? How is it gonna make them that much more apt to the subject?
Well, I think if you care about abortion in America, it helps to know why people are always talking about what seem kind of like the facts about abortion. So I think the book is there to help you kind of make sense of why anti-abortion strategies are functioning the way they are, which I think helps you understand what's coming next, and also be kind of more alert to some of the threats to abortion that you probably aren't paying attention to. So it kind of goes all the way back to the beginning to trace the origins of these strategies. And it focuses too on why often abortion opponents are not talking about fetal rights all the time. They're talking about things like abortion being unsafe for women or abortion causing fetal pain, this sort of world of alternative facts that Donald Trump's kind of put us in, right? Where we're fighting about what reality is and what science is. We're not fighting about who has a right to do what. And I think if you don't know the history and you sort of are reading about abortion restrictions, it doesn't really make much sense, right? You don't know why abortion opponents are doing this. You don't know what they're getting from it. And you don't know what that means for the big picture in terms of Roe v. Wade. So I wanted to kind of show what had changed and why it had changed and why it's been in some ways a more effective way to dismantle abortion rights than the sort of direct, there's a right to fetal life approach that most of us are more familiar with.
Going back to my original statement, and I'll ask it to you again, and that is, if that entity is dependent on you, why should I be able to tell you or force you?
Well, I mean, I don't think you should. I think the answer abortion opponents give is that it's kind of a complicated one, but they would say it's a civil rights issue, right? And I think we'll probably see more of that coming. One of the interesting sort of pivots you see abortion opponents making, and one of the issues that's definitely coming down the pike, is to argue that women have abortions for reasons that violate not just fetal rights, but the rights, for example, of Black people. There's a new strategy to argue for bans on abortion for reasons of rape, sex, or disability. So you see abortion opponents essentially saying, if we're against discrimination, you shouldn't discriminate against life in the womb. Obviously, pro-choice people say that's not, discrimination law recognizes that there are sometimes real differences between people, right? For example, pregnancy discrimination law says pregnant people are different from non-pregnant people, and the law can recognize that. And so obviously fetal life in the womb is not independent, to your point, in the way that other people are. And therefore the distinctions are totally legit. But anti-abortion people don't see the world that way. And increasingly, I think one of the things I learned in the book was that they don't see lots of things about the world the same way. They don't see public health authorities the same way. They don't see scientific evidence necessarily the same way. They don't trust the media. And so we're in a position where finding common ground on the question you asked is even harder because we don't agree on basic facts.
Mary, what would you have liked me to ask you that I hadn't asked you?
I don't know. I'm trying to think. I can't think of anything. That was pretty thorough.
Well, look, Mary Ziegler, a legal historian and professor at Florida State University. Thank you so kindly for having been here on Politics Done Right.
No, thanks for having me.
I'm Egberto Willies, host of Politics Done Right, an independent news program. I post several news videos of interest every day. I ask you so kindly to subscribe to my channel, and please leave me some comments. Thank you very much.